Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Mass Communication Division's 5 Years Out program, examining the past, present, and future of mass communication pedagogy. Today we have 5 panelists. We have a rather free-form plan. You could have a free-form plan in mind. Robert K. Avery from the University of Utah, Valerie Goff-Whitecap from the University of Pittsburgh, Sharon Mazzarella from James Madison University, Michael Murray from the University of Missouri, St. Louis, and Nancy Signorelli from the University of Delaware. And I am Dr. Rebecca Chory from West Virginia University, and I am the chair of the panel. What we're going to do is I'm going to kind of put out a topic, a general question, and the panelists will give their insight into it. If the audience wants to chime in, fine. Just feel free or put your hand up and I'll call on you. And we're going to try to have a conversation, a discussion with question and interaction rather than a group of formal presentations. So please feel free to respond and to get involved. First, I guess really the first thing was kind of about what you've done in the past, what topics you've taught in the past, and depending on how long you've been teaching mass communication, what have you been doing in the past, and then what are you doing now, what do you see happening? So go right ahead and get started.
I'm Bob Avery at the University of Utah, and it's a pleasure to join these distinguished colleagues up here. I wanted to go first simply because I'm much better at looking at where I've been than having any idea as to where I'm going. And so I thought that if I got my 2 cents in early, then I could sit back and find out where the future of the field really is. The question which was originally framed for us was to give us some idea of pedagogy and mass communication education as it's evolved. And for me, what that does is immediately bring up the historical tension between theory and practice. And it's not one that has disappeared, but it certainly was there when I came into this field, and it continues to persist to this day. The tension really, I think, originated by the fact that we are descendants of a lot of teachers who came into this field as academics after being very successful practitioners. And so what they were doing was to introduce us as academics to the field that existed out there of media practices, and they did it in an atheoretical way. That because it was experiential. And it has taken really several generations of academics to find the theory that now really runs equally with the practical application. And so, I mean, any one of us here, I think, could provide a laundry list of courses that historically were considered theory courses like mass media and society, the various introductions to mass communication or mass media, mass comm law, media ethics, mass communication history, and they were situated within the curriculum, juxtaposed with, writing and reporting for the mass media, 1, 2, 3, magazine article writing, specialty reporting, radio journalism, television journalism, writing for the new media, now in a more contemporary frame. And the same kind of things could be seen on the television or radio side of the aisle with such things as television or visual media production, 1, 2, 3, audio production, 1, 2, 3, and courses in on-air performance and the like. And so historically, I think that's really the kind of curriculum that most of us either were exposed to as students or certainly contributed to as academics. And that, I think, I don't know, I'd be interested in finding out from others, but my knowledge of looking at this from a historical perspective is that pretty much runs the gamut across our discipline.
One of the things that I discovered differently, or that happens differently now, is the difference in interpersonal communication that takes place around the media. And going back to Lull's study in 1982 of the way that you negotiate what you're watching on television, for example, around when there was one TV in the home, the students today have really changed that dynamic. They are not so much negotiating as leaving the room. So that interpersonal, I'll watch what you want if you watch what I want, all of those kinds of things, and exposure to something that may not have been your first choice seems to have changed. So I haven't been in the field as long as some of my distinguished colleagues, so I will pass the baton on.
I'd actually like to respond to what Bob was saying, because that's been my experience as well. And what I hear you saying, there's two different things going on there. There's the fact that there's the theory track and the practical track, and there's not necessarily been an integration of the two of them. Also, I heard you say writing for the media 1, 2, and 3, audio production 1, 2, and 3, so that there's a lot more of that than the theory. So that there's those two things, and that's been my experience as well. That the theory aspect is kind of, well, it's like, this is the stuff we got to give you this, but it's not really the stuff you're here for. Right. Yeah.
Do you mind if I jump in? Our program at Diller is a little bit different because our program has, from the get-go, from the late 80s until now, continuing to now, focuses on both theory and research. And we do have a little bit of the practical, but it's not a major focus. So our students, many of them will come in and say that many of them will come in and say that they want to be TV producers, they want to be on camera. And one of the things that we often talk with them about, well, do you want to be a camera pusher for the rest of your life, or do you want to be telling people how to push those cameras? And with the orientation that we give them, focusing on theory, they learn about the dynamics of how to be a honcho rather than a minion in that. And also we do focus a lot on theory so that they really understand what we as researchers are contributing to the field. And so we have them having to, one of the projects that we want our upper level classes to have is some focus on doing research. So a lot of my students, when they are taking their upper level courses, are doing some hands-on research in mass communication and really understanding that. So I see that, yes, we have evolved in terms of the topics that we are looking at, but somewhat the dynamics of what we are, the way we're doing it, seem to be staying the same, at least in our program. And our students, when they graduate, they say, wow, I'm really in a better position to get a good job or to go on to graduate school.
Yeah, I would say from my perspective that the curriculum we have and the pedagogy we use to convey the information is more fully integrated today. And being one of the resident old guys, I was in a panel this morning and they went around the room and told how long they'd been coming to meetings, and I said 35 years, and you could see a couple of the younger people, they just like, oh my God, you're still alive. But if by comparison to the beginnings in the integration of mass communication into the NCA or SCA, initially, I see that, at least I think that things, we may still be in silos, but I don't think we're nearly as restrictive as we once were. And I think we're a lot more inclusive in terms of teaching. And I think by and large, at least in my experience, we're taking teaching a lot more seriously. And I think there's a lot more attention being given to it, a lot of awards or rewards for good teaching. So I think in that sense we're we're pretty well off. I, without sounding too self-serving, I did 2 books on teaching mass communication, one 10 years ago, teaching mass communication for Prager in '94, and then Roy Moore and I just did one for Blackwell just relatively recently, 2006, and then it was just published in India. And it was really striking to me that when the way the project evolved was we asked people to describe how they teach their courses. In a couple of places, a couple of the ladies who were here, for example, their institutions were represented. And then in the course of investigating how the courses were being taught, people would talk about their mentors who helped them out along the way. And so we started to integrate essays into it, remembering a mentor. And what I was struck by was the diversity of the people who were identified as mentors. So there were some, quantitative types, Joe Foley from Ohio State, depending on who the contributors were. But there were also some theorists in, Marshall McLuhan, Father Ong. There were just a wide variety. And I thought in that sense, that was really impressive to me. That I thought we've come a really long way in that regard. And then as I look at the programs here, I see so many media-related programs that aren't even necessarily involved with Mass Comm Division per se. Of course, Mass Comm Division gives an award for good teaching. And even like in my specialty in communication history, Mass Comm history and broadcasting, history of broadcasting, I'm just seeing a lot more specialization in teaching, which in research, of course, which I think is a real positive development for the field. And I notice if you look at the back of the, the advertisement, the display ad for University of Illinois, they've got a couple of people, Bob McChesney and Dan Schiller, are listed as being communication history gurus at Illinois. So I think from somebody who's been coming to these meetings for a long time, you would never have seen that, really up until about 10 years ago. And I always kind of felt like in the assignments that I've held at different places, that we were kind of missing the boat on that regard, that a lot of the disciplines were a lot more focused, politically correct in the sense that they were getting specialization and having others kind of bring junior scholars along in that regard. So I'm blabbing on, but at least from my perspective, I think things are much better, a whole lot better, really.
Going back to the practice versus theory, I think it's also important to recognize that mass communication is one of those areas that is housed in a number of different colleges or departments. For example, my background is in departments of communication. So I have degrees in communication and communication studies. And so when my teaching in my own classes with mass communication have been rooted in more of what used to be speech communication. And so we have no practice oriented. It's always been, it's from a different perspective. And so, for example, at West Virginia University and in Michigan State Department of Communication, which is my experience, is there was no practice. It was all theory, research, and primarily effects oriented. So I think that's another aspect that perhaps distinguishes us from some of the other divisions at NCA, is that we really draw from a lot of different perspectives and origins and where we come from that would dictate what we teach and what we will teach. Perhaps what is going on now, where in terms of topics, methodologies, what are you teaching now? What trends have you seen? If we talk about past, present, future, what's the present?
Well, I think one of the biggest challenges for all of us right now is dealing with new media. And on the plane out, I was sitting with my colleague Betsy Purse, and we were kind of talking about this and saying, well, people are always going to want to have their television. And so we really have to understand that. And it was really fortuitous this morning. The front page of USA Today has, could this be the season for web TV? And talking about how we have the new generation of television sets are going to allow people to access web TV without it being computer-like, because that will turn a lot of people off. And so I think it's for us to understand as scholars and for us to teach our students about these media that are different, but yet they're not different. They're still, and how people still want to have their television. And so I think that for us is a big hurdle to overcome. I don't know if it's a hurdle, but it's just something we have to deal with on a yearly basis in putting our courses together.
I can camel on that. I teach a beginning course in media, so they're coming to me not from a practice point of view, they're coming from communication studies, but they're just opening their eyes to media. And as I was thinking about how they had changed and whether they were really watching television as much or doing something else, I also was cleaning out my garage. I found 2 papers that had been presented at SCA in 1996 on television viewing habits of college students. So in a totally unscientific manner, I compared my current college students with the ones from 1996 to see if there were significant differences in the way they used television, which then could guide us in teaching into the future. First, I found that one of the studies by Kerner and Porter said that students watched on Thursdays. They don't. They watch on Sundays. Now. And I think that has to do a lot with football.
That the bars on Thursday
and
nights.
Yes, Thursday is Taco Thursday. So at least it is at Pitt. So that's the beginning of the weekend. They are out partying at Hemingway's for Taco Thursday. And they are watching television, though, a lot more alone than they used to. They have more television sets. They're not having to do that social negotiation that I mentioned before. They're multitasking even more than they did before. 92% of my current students say that they do other things while the television is on. So the level of concentration that our students used to have isn't there. So maybe then talking about how does the television or how does the practice overcome that multitasking at some point. All of them surf, compared to 55% said in 1996 that they never surf while they're watching. Only 25% said they don't surf now. But still, primarily men are holding the clicker. More women have taken it, but men are holding it a lot. Also, in 1996, their study found that 4% of the students said that they watched television more than 4 hours a week. In my current study, 92% of them watched more than 4 hours a week. So it's on a lot more. And it was on as soon as they walked in the door. More of them turn it on as background noise. The women are watching more sports, a lot more sports than they used to. And nobody in my study admitted to watching any daytime television. I doubt it, but they wouldn't admit it.
Good third-person effect study.
Yes, third-person effect. I think that those kinds of things guide then the way I am approaching them in the classroom today. What gets your attention? What doesn't get your attention? What makes you concentrate on what's on? Why do the women say that they watch more sports? Are you being forced to watch more sports in order to spend time with your man? And my class just came out of Media-Free Week, where they could use a phone as a phone and a computer for work. And other than that, if it plugged in or ran on batteries, they couldn't use it. And I told them it was like being on a diet. If you eat a donut, own up to it and go back on the diet. So journal to me what happened. And one of the girls journaled that Sunday afternoon, she and her boyfriend took a long walk and talked. And heaven help her if she ever has to do this again. Because they would much rather watch football.
Wow, I don't know if I can follow that. Let me, by contrast to what I explained, historically, and what I see as the roots, a couple quick reminders. When I became a member of this association, which was actually over 40 years ago, this group that we're in now, or sponsoring this, was called Radio TV Film. And Norm remembers, some of the rest of us remember, it was that before it became a mass communication division. Now, we worked very hard to create a new journal for this association that would help situate mass communication. And there's a long history to the various negotiations of making things happen. But that journal, which I was very proud to be able to help found, was called Critical Studies in Mass Communication. Now, that journal subsequently became changed, the title, to Critical Studies in Media Communication, okay? And that also reflects, as much as anything, I think, shifting emphases and politics within our association and whatnot. But the point I want to make is that in the time that I have been at the University of Utah and actively involved in this association, which is since 1971, what I have seen is a growing emphasis in theory that is pervading our coursework and pervading the mass comm area in very definitive ways. At the University of Utah, for example, we have now large lecture classes that have never existed 10 years ago. Principles of visual communication, media criticism, and so forth, which I think reflect the introduction of critical and cultural theory into the mainstream of this discipline and specifically the mass comm area. We continue to have a lot of practical courses, of course, but the courses have changed dramatically, and so the numbers of radio-oriented courses and TV-oriented courses have been displaced by web design and web narrative and so on. And so, let's face it, McLuhan was right. The medium is the message. And as we, as academics, respond to the shifts in the marketplace and the shifts in audience behavior, what we do is reinvent our curriculum in order to make it current, and while it follows I think a theoretical trajectory in our research, it also is ever mindful of preparing our students for careers that will allow them to take an upward movement within these quickly changing industries. We have courses now that look at the applications of social media, courses in animation. Of course, everybody's now on the convergence journalism bandwagon. And one of the areas that we really found the great amount of student interest in today is in documentary studies. And that interest, I think, really reflects their interest in social issues and the breadth of their experience, not only in our department, but across the university curriculum.
I wanted to get into this because Nancy began by talking about the importance of new media, and that we have to realize that. And you were talking about the differences between students 15 years ago, 13 years ago, and now. And Bob is talking about, kind of again, the changes in the curriculum with new media and everything. What I what I found that has changed in the way I teach is that my students know so much more about new media than I do, and this is their lives, this is what they're doing every day, they're so immersed in it. So when I teach my youth and media class, for example, I'm a baby boomer, I'm an old person, and I go there and, who am I to teach them about what they're doing on a day-to-day basis? So what I try and do is give them the tools they need, the theoretical tools to understand what this new media is, how the role it's playing in their lives. Let's look at this stuff critically. Look at these websites that you're on. Look at the portrayal of teens in movies and that kind of thing. And they really respond to that because they think, I never thought about this before. And to me, that's the most important thing that I can give them, isn't to tell them, oh, well, this website does this and this, Twitter does that. They know that. But to help them understand its role in their own lives, I think that's really important pedagogically for me.
I very much agree, Sharon, because so much of the time they don't understand how this overarching media that they are involved with affects what they think, what they do, what they believe about themselves, and that whole sense of, I never realized that, is that aha phenomenon that you want to be able to get from them in terms of
And
class.
that hasn't changed. That aha moment still occurs. I taught 7th and 8th grade media for 33 years, heaven help us. And so there was very little theory in that and less practice, but the aha moments of trying to explain to them how you were learning from what was out there was really essential, and I'm still seeing that.
One of the most, the courses I enjoy teaching the most, I teach in the summertime, and I teach an intensive course. We do a full course in 10 days. We meet for about 5 hours a day, but it's for teachers who have no experience with mass communication, really any of the courses, and we talk about these things. We look at a lot of instructional media, and they come across every day. It's my students do this, my students do that. Now I understand what's going on.
Oh, you want me to say something?
I don't know. No, I just jumped in before you
Yes,
a couple
Mike.
times.
Q Mike.
Q Mike.
Yeah, I really identify with what you say in terms of what you're doing in the classroom and stuff. And I would go back, the historical part of me is thinking in terms of when we mention introductory courses, within the context of this organization, whenever you talked about an introductory course, it was always either a public speaking course or an interpersonal course. And I think, following up on what Bob said, that the curriculum's developed to the point now that we've reached such a critical mass in terms of our enrollments and stuff that we fall into that, category of having introductory courses that are pretty good size. I always try to, wherever I've been, I've tried to look at it from the standpoint of skills courses versus the theory courses and look at it like that. And I found that by interpreting, like taking a public speaking course and calling it a skills course and calling a radio or a audio or a TV production course a skills course, it sort of helps in some ways, too, to kind of get people thinking and working together. In terms of our curriculum, it's for us, for my particular situation, we went from having a department which was mostly a speech comm department to a department that was very methodologically focused on social sciences, to having some of the other people in media studies move over and form their separate unit. So, but I still think that they have many things in common, and I think the students benefit from that. I also, since I teach media history mostly, I tried to use things in the news and talk about, recently the passing of, Walter Cronkite and Don Hewitt and a number of those, old codgers from the golden era of CBS, and tried to talk about what they did in terms of putting it in the context of a marketplace that's radically changing, looking at what they did, how they did it, and so on. So I think that we're much more together as a discipline, if you can call it that, but I have the same history, that Rebecca described of having come from speech department, speech communication, or speech and dramatic art as it once was, and then moving on into communication, and now more and more it seems like media studies. I do find it strange that within our context, and this is not to be critical, but it's just a point of that I've observed, is I can remember last year I went to the NCA in San Diego, and I ran into Norm coming out of his session. This session was featuring Fred Friendly's wife, Ruth Friendly, was on a panel, and I thought, wow, this is a very bizarre situation, because it was a very well-attended session, but I thought, I wonder how many people at this convention actually know that that was Fred Friendly's spouse who was running that session. And I talked to her afterwards, and I said, she talked in her presentation about this George Clooney movie, and she said, never in my wildest dreams would I think that Fred would be portrayed by this Playboy actor, and the kids would actually be talking about that again. So I thought as an organization we might have missed the boat a little bit somewhere there, that having Ruth speak about it a little bit more and talking about her experiences, and especially in light of that film, would have been interesting for a lot of people. So.
Okay. Thank you. What about and maybe you've already kind of covered this, in terms of specific methods in teaching. Have you personally changed? And I think, well, go ahead, Sharon.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Oh, no.
Thank you. One of the biggest things that's changed, and I've been teaching for 21 years now, since I left graduate school. One of the things that changed for me is I find that I have to use a lot more audio-visual media stuff in the classroom. I have to show a lot more videos. I have to, bring in a lot more examples. We have to get on the web and play, that kind of thing. That the lecture style just isn't going to work, no matter how big the classroom is. You really have to show very specific examples, and that works to stimulate discussion, but it also works to keep down the boredom level. I mean, I hate to admit it, but that's just, kind of the Sesame Street effect, linking the entertainment with the education.
I find that I'm having to explain to myself sort of what I'm doing, and also trying to share that with others. We're part of this program, the Preparing Future Faculty program, and some of the victims of that are in the room. Steve, was it 2 years ago you did this? Yeah. So basically, Steve, I'll put him on the spot, shadowed me for, how long was it? I don't know. For a day, and wrote a couple of reports on it, and sat in on a faculty meeting, and then so Steve would ask me a lot of questions, and a lot of these questions I had never thought about before, like why I was doing what I was doing, because and it just so happens we had a second round of Preparing Future Faculty people on campus this last week from the journalism school side, and the same deal is I was tempted to, like I started off here, to do the wise-ass thing of saying, well, have you read my books, which is always, if you've done a lot of interviews, people will do that to you. And I did make a few references to that, but he said, well, in terms of organizing the class, he says, I have a lot of trouble sometimes. I don't know, he isn't here, but I said, in my younger days when I started teaching, I always felt like I had to be super organized, and I had to have everything like right down to a T, and I would show a little video, documentaries, and so on, and so on and so forth. And I said, now, in my older days, I've tried to step back from that because of what Sharon was saying about the students are so into this, and you really never know what they're picking up, like even on the history topics. You'll never know what they might chime in on, and you're sort of shocked. At least that's my experience in knowing, and hearing about their experiences and stuff. But I guess one thing in terms of the context of what we're doing, I know the AJMC does have, in their Mass Common Society division, is running a competition now. Some of you might be familiar with it, where beginning teachers are actually submitting portfolios. And I've judged that for about the last 5 years. And again, I'm very impressed with what the younger, assistant professors are coming out with. It's a lot of tech stuff, and integrating material and being tuned into the students and so on. So again, I would say that in a lot of ways we're much better off in terms of being kind of circumspect and looking at and reviewing what we're doing and explaining what we're doing. So I think in that sense we're much better off too.
We were asked to reflect not only on the methods that have evolved, but also thinking about specific topics for the future, where things may be headed. I honestly think, and I picked this up not only in our own discussions within our department and more broadly within the discipline, but I hear it when I go out into the community and do speaking at Rotary and Kiwanis and so on. There is a real concern out there about ethical issues, and I predict that there's going to be a growing emphasis on broad-based ethical considerations, media ethics, and more broadly, I think, within the communication discipline. That, I think, is going to be part of the engine that is going to fuel a more broadly based interdisciplinary approach to what we are doing and moving communication to a greater position of centrality within higher education. I think we have reached a point of maturation now where we're really having an impact within our respective institutions. And so I think we're going to start to see just much greater interdisciplinary work and the position of communication within that. I use as an example on our own campus peace and conflict studies, where it's now situated along with the folks in social behavioral science. Our program in environmental communication is now being increasingly across the university's environmental studies program and a new environmental humanities master's degree. The issues that have been talked about here in terms of social media and the students' fascination with it, and increasingly concerns about how do you harness its possibility. And then we have, I can't tell you how many calls a week I get where they want someone, send me an intern or send me a student, we'll put them on the payroll. We need somebody to come down here and tell us how to get with Twitter, to get with Facebook, to get with MySpace and so forth. And so we are living in an age where the students in the classroom know more about the subject matter by far than the faculty that are teaching the classes. And quite frankly, I don't see that as necessarily a bad thing. I really do believe that there is a currency about the content that's in the mass communication classes today that is better than ever, and those faculty members that are really tuning into in their own methods and using the technology that the students know so well, I think are really having there's a genuine synergy, and I think the classes are becoming increasingly student-centered in a positive way.
I'd like to follow up on that, actually. I'm in an administrative position now. This is my first semester as the director of the School of Communication Studies at James Madison University. And I'm noticing the exact thing that Bob is talking about, this centrality of the communication discipline within the university. So a substance abuse minor was being proposed, and they wanted to use some of our health comm classes. Different public affairs minors and majors want to use our classes. The public relations classes, environmental communication being used in the environmental studies minor. I'm seeing that, and I think that's fantastic, because I think we've been a marginalized discipline for a long time. It's just communication, that kind of thing. But I'm also seeing something that's a little bit disturbing to me, And that's this idea that anybody can teach communication. And that some disciplines, instead of coming to communications departments and saying, we'd like to use your classes, we'd like to have you provide us with your expertise in our thing, they just add classes, mass comm classes or health classes. But they're not coming from the same disciplinary and theoretical background that we come from. And that concerns me a little bit. And I'm wondering if other people are observing that as well. So while we're becoming, communication concepts are becoming central, are we being central, or are other people kind of taking over our territory?
Yes, I very much agree. One of the things at Delaware are that sometimes new classes, when they're proposed, have to go through various faculty senate, and we have to be so vigilant to make sure that courses that are being offered are not stepping on our toes, so to speak, and just be able to say, hey, you can't teach that, we teach that. And that's one of our courses, and if you want students to take it, have them, look at it from the perspective of communication.
Yeah, and it's not a turf thing. It's not like that's ours, you can't have it. It's just more of a respect. I'm not trying to teach physics in my classes, right? I respect another person's discipline and their expertise and their background, but I don't necessarily see us getting that same respect.
That's also being fought in the public schools. Having come from a public school background and being involved in elementary and secondary division, districts are dropping the communication, but even NCA adopted the College Board standards for speaking, listening, and media literacy. So unfortunately, a lot of those classes are being picked up in areas by English teachers, et cetera, who have no communication background, who don't know how to teach media literacy, and are being handed a test that they have to teach to later on that doesn't include media literacy or any communication. And so it's falling by the wayside. So when they're coming then to college, they may be coming from a point, well, my English teacher taught me that. Why do I need to know more than that?
Okay, I guess as we are progressing in the hour, the future, what do you see are challenges, opportunities, potential things that will be going on in the future? What are your predictions for mass comm pedagogy?
Well, I suspect, and I would sort of hope for the idea that we would continue to become more and more specialized. I know that bothers people, but I think the problem that was just described is sometimes, and of course at a major institution like James Madison in a specialized unit, you get an interesting dynamic across campus. But I'm just saying, this is kind of one of my pet peeves, is that in the traditional College of Arts and Sciences context, which I'm no longer in, we would always kind of have to battle that issue of having people who are very highly specialized from other disciplines, where we were doing a lot of different things and sort of priding ourselves on being good teachers. But I think sort of history's kind of caught up with us, and we're lucky in the sense that we still attract a lot of people to the discipline who want to do a good job in the classroom. But I do think we run the risk of and I mentioned this to Steve when we talked about this Preparing Future Faculty program, that if you wanted to look down the road at your career and identify one or two areas where you would say you were like a leading authority and so on, and of course you come to a meeting like this and you see that people have a variety of interests. But I would say that I think, for example, what Bob said about media ethics or communication ethics is a perfect example of something that's going to continue to develop. I hate to name drop again, but I have the third edition of Media Law and Ethics got reviewed this summer in Journalism Quarterly, and the reviewer said, I hope I'm not offending anybody in the room, but the reviewer said, the problem with this book, she took an interesting approach. She went back to the first edition of the book, and it was the first book to do media law and ethics together. And she said, this is what they said in the first review of this book, not enough ethics. And now here we are, whatever it is, 15 years later, then the third, and we're working on the fourth edition. And the reviewer says, I went back to the first, I would agree with the first reviewer, not enough ethics. And here we are going, wow, we thought we really tried to focus on that. We even recruited a former newspaper editor to offer a specific chapter on ethics. But again, I think what Bob's saying is so true. And I think that if there are any young people in the room, I would say that kind of counsel is very sound to look to the future and say, now what would be the area where I could really have an impact, and what would be consistent with my personal interest and still be fairly focused. Because again, going back to my original point, I would always say to our faculty, we would try to get professors promoted, and sitting on a promotion committee at the college level or the campus level, and looking at situations where the people evaluating our professors were super specialized, and positions, for example, in my interest in media history, where the history professors or the English professors would say, well, to have a complete department, we have to have this person in whatever it is, Russian history or what have you. And I thought, wow, we're really missing the boat on that one, because these are people who are evaluating our professors. We're trying to do a lot of different things to satisfy numbers. We need to sort of step back and say, this is the constituent group we need to have to do a good job in terms of the mission that we have. So.
Yes, in terms of the future, I think all the new media, we do have to become more proficient in understanding it. Not necessarily that we'll teach it, but just being able to understand it. But I think we also have to take our theories and try to see how our theories relate to new media, and do we need a new theoretical focus, or can our existing theories be expanded so as to incorporate new media? And also, someone, I guess, Valerie, I think, did you make the comment about all the students multitasking all the time? And that multitasking as an educator so bothers me, because you'll give an exam and they'll say, I didn't do well, and I studied so hard. And I sometimes want to bite my tongue, because what I really want to say to them, and what else were you doing while you were studying so hard for this? How much of this were you doing, and how much of other things that you were listening to? So I think we have to, try to understand what they mean by multitasking, and possibly try to get them to understand, hey, sometimes you can't multitask all the time.
Just a comment that teaching some of the old media like radio and television, we're becoming historians and teaching more media history than we are current media practice in some ways. I find that my students, some of them now, have never watched I Love Lucy, which is a very stupid example, but we have to realize where they have entered the stream. And I constantly have to remind myself, they don't know the Smothers Brothers. If I say CBS, that's still somewhat of a foreign concept of the three major networks, and the importance of all of that. So I have to keep stepping back and changing the way I'm teaching based upon where they entered.
I'm going to project the future to go back to something that Bob said when he began with the old way being the theory silo, the practice silo. Given that media content and media technology is changing so rapidly, continuously changing, that we can't teach them the same kinds of practical skills and expect it to be relevant even 6 months after they graduate. We need to give them the tools to think critically about the world, to write, to be knowledgeable about different things. We have to move away from giving them skills and understandings of technology, because that they're going to learn on the job. But we need to have them be educated individuals and go out there so that they have something to say with whatever the technology of the moment is. And I think that, to me, is the most important thing that we need to do in the future. So it's not only integrating the theory in the practice, but maybe even moving a little bit away from the practice.
Sharon, I wonder, is the content really changing? Because for me, it's like the more it changes, the more it stays the same.
Right.
So when we start to look at what women are doing, what people of color are doing, and so on in all of these different venues, has it changed that much? I know that there are changes, but I'd like to, I think we still need to do the studies and look at some of the new media and try to get to some of those images.
And I think you're right. And when I said content change, I'm talking more stylistically.
Okay.
Yes, but
Okay.
you're absolutely right. stylistically, maybe glitzy or faster paced or whatever. But the basic underlying stuff, you're absolutely right. Still kind of the same after all these years.
Still the same.
I'm going to go out on a limb here, and the issue really is outside of this association. But since this association has never offered the kind of accreditation of academic departments that some departments wanted to see NCA get into, a lot of departments that have mass media programs have relied on AEJMC or AEJCM, whatever the council is there, the proper acronym within that association, to provide accreditation. And I would be interested, as we look forward, there appears to be a trend among some of the major institutions, and a lot of them I recognize are R1 institutions, but there is a move at essentially stepping away and giving up this accreditation that was once seen as so valuable for the simple reason, it's not a simple reason, it's actually quite complex, but the accreditation process and the expectations and the various ways that it's being done is actually being seen as an impediment to the progression of very fast-moving, cutting-edge curricula at various institutions where things are happening so quickly and walls are coming down, and there are new ways of framing curriculum in such a way that it essentially adhering to the traditional accreditation expectations is limiting the faculties to do the best work that they think they can do. And I'd like to ask, this is a discussion we're certainly having, and I'm wondering whether or not it's happening on any of the other campuses.
What would a dean think about that?
Director.
Well, what we do at our campus is we have a four-campus system at the University of Missouri, and so basically we have a review team, and so I'll get sent to UMKC or Columbia. I've been to Columbia a couple of times to try to do that, what Bob described, to make sure that we're not trying to impose a standard, but rather try to figure out what people are doing and maybe how they could be doing it a little bit better. So I learn a lot on every one of those visits, mostly because the campuses are so different in terms of resources and history and so on. I thought there was some movement afoot in NCA to have to ask people to serve in a kind of similar mode where they would be willing to make visits and so on. But the complexity of it is so radical. I mean, in our case, when you look at four campuses, if you've done it over a period of time, you pretty much get to know the situation, the people, the resources, and the levels of support. Coming in out of the blue, I'm not sure how it would work. And I'm also not sure about how the expense would be handled, but because it can be very costly, I know it is with the HAMC or the visits that they do. But I do think it does provide a standard of performance and quite often, at least in my case, like what I've learned that when we do our visits to UMKC, for example, they've had a kind of history of partnering with the film societies in Kansas City. Their film program seems to be pretty well developed, much more so than ours. So, I get a lot out of it, and then it gets shared that way. So it's just a lucky situation, I think, that we've been able to benefit from.
Okay, we would like to really open it up for questions or comments now.
This goes back several comments earlier. Something Valerie said, and a number of you echoed about changes, not just the velocity, but the acceleration in change in media. And I'm wondering if any of you have encountered something that I started to notice about 2 years ago. Students who are very anxious about their relationship with media because they have younger siblings who are more adept at things. And they have friends who are 1 year out of college who have learned what a webinar is or have encountered Second Life. And they've never heard of these things. It's like Mars. The way I address it in class is to try to give them tools of understanding what these things are, not to go and create an avatar and see what it's all about. But I wonder if there is this, or maybe it's a perpetual blip where the students we get in college are behind their younger siblings and behind their friends who are 1 or 2 years out.
My sense is that will always be true because the media is happening faster than any one individual can keep up with it. So the younger generation is always better at it. And my students report that they just can't live without certain things. And we're creating generations of that. Or we're not, but society is creating the generations of, oh, how could I live without Twitter? How could I live without, and then whatever the new thing is. I don't know if that answered your question.
But it's also partly my friends who are now in the working world have learned things that I never knew existed. How could that be? I'm the younger generation. I can at least, if my 13-year-old sister understands something better than I do, that I can deal with. And they talk about their younger siblings like adults talk about their children. In my day, we didn't have Twitter.
And that's exactly what I was going to say. Because I teach youth and media, we get into that discussion. And we get into that discussion the very first day when I ask them, why are you in this class? Because it's an elective class. And they all talk about their younger siblings or the kids they babysit for. These kids today, and they do sound like they're 60 years old. I've never had them refer to the slightly older generation, their older siblings, or whatever, the people that maybe graduated the 2 years before they did. But they do seem to have a very negative attitude about their younger siblings. Not a jealousy. It doesn't seem to come out as a jealousy, but more of a, somebody's got to do something about these kids. This just isn't right. And I find that fascinating because that generation gap has gotten smaller and smaller and smaller. It's not nearly a generation anymore, just a couple of years.
I just want to speak to my own argument about the growing convergence and consolidation and cross-fertilization that I really think is happening. If you take the example of the new personal media, and you think about it within a theoretical or methodological context in terms of trying to understand and really investigate in a serious way how this is operating and how it's impacting the kid's psyche and their patterns of study and everything else that we've referred to up here. I don't know how we could do that without drawing on the extensive literature within interpersonal communication. And the interpersonal communication area now seems to me to be just absolutely central to our understanding of the practices of the new media and how it's changing the lifestyles of the subjects that we're not only teaching but we're also studying.
But then there's the question of what is actually mass communication? Is Twitter mass communication? Is Facebook mass communication? I have my own opinions.
Well, let me. When we started critical studies in mass communication, if you go back and look at the type style for that journal when it first came out, it's all been changed now because it's merged with all the other journals. But the M was different. And the reason for that was we wanted to ask the readership and the scholarly community to help define, in this day and age, what constitutes mass communication, and does it even exist? And of course, some years later, NCA chose to change the name to Critical Studies in Media Communication. So, there are those that would argue there's no reason for us to even call ourselves mass communication anymore. We've outlived it. We should be calling ourselves the Division of Media Communication.
In the midst of all this change, one constant we talk about is the need to incorporate theory and practice. I'd be very interested in hearing from you what are the one or two theoretical constructs, or you might say foundational interdisciplinary or foundational disciplinary beliefs that you hope your students emerge from your universities with. And then do you believe that 10 years out, those constructs will still be helpful? I mean, there may be a long laundry list, and you've talked about ethics, and Fluent and Fong showed up here too, but just you five. What do you want your students to go away with in theory, and then will it matter 10 years out?
Well, since I mentioned McLuhan and Ong, I heard a panel here in this room yesterday about Marshall McLuhan, in which one of the participants said that his professor, when he was a graduate student, told him that McLuhan's ideas are interesting, but if you ever put his name in a research paper, I can guarantee you it won't get published. And if you ever mention his name on a job interview, you will not get hired. And so when I talk about Marshall McLuhan, I talk about all of his interesting ideas and stuff, and then I talk about what a theory really is and whether what he was doing was actually theoretical or just getting people to think about a lot of things that were happening at that particular time. So the social scientist, we go through a series of, one of the interesting things that I thought about in preparation for talking with you all was the fact that when I started teaching in terms of textbooks in journalism, on the journalism side, there was just an Emery and Emery book. I don't know whether you'd be familiar with that in terms of journalism history. And then I started using a paperback book by Don Pember from the University of Washington that I used for many years. And I thought, in trying to answer your question, that by comparison today, this is another sign of how far we've come, because you can pick up an introductory textbook that will make very little mention of Marshall McLuhan. You could pick up another introductory textbook that might have a whole section on Marshall McLuhan. And so I'm kind of eclectic in my approach. I try to look at the social science theories that are out there, and then I try to talk a little bit about the historical development in terms of some individuals like Marshall McLuhan and Father Ong. I really don't talk about Father Ong, it's too complicated. But I went to his school, I went to St. Louis University as an undergraduate and sat in on his classes and so on, and to try to convey that information would be pretty tough. But as I'm sure you know, since you mentioned that, that name that a lot of McLuhan's ideas were supposed to have come from Father Ong in terms of, how they played out in terms of society. So I'm rambling again, but I would say that I try to take a historical approach where I'm talking about, the Fred Siebert models that we used to talk about in theory, and now of course, with the fall of the Soviet Union and the change in some of the systems, we can't talk about it quite the same way. I can only talk about it as a kind of historical model in terms of open communication and dealing with the national governments, et cetera. But I do try to work in the other, the uses and gratifications, all the stuff that we would be talking about at a meeting like this in a social science context, because that's sort of where we are, I think, as a department where we are, and as a discipline kind of where we are. You don't want to miss out on an opportunity to help a student kind of get acquainted with something that they might be able to take to the next level.
I would look at, 5 theories or theoretical areas that are critical, and some of the recent research I came across a study by Jim Potter and one of his students, that these are the ones that you found most often in the literature. Agenda setting and framing, I think, are absolutely critical. I think cultivation, that I do my research in, is very critical. It's been around forever and still relevant. Uses and gratifications, particularly relevant. And third-person effect. I think third-person effect, no one wants to take responsibility for what they do, but not me, but Johnny down the street. It always reminds me of a thing that I read. I forget where I read it, but a mother is watching the marching band go by in the parade, and she turns to her neighbor and says, "Everyone's out of step but my Johnny."
I think to go along with the third-person effect and that idea, the one thing that I try to make, if I want my students to come away with that I emphasize in my classes, is that being conscious of the media does impact you, and it does impact other people. And to be aware of that and to recognize that you're influenced by it. And I think that that's something that will be relevant 10 years, 20 years down the line, regardless of what the media type is, that it's not simply, we don't simply use it, but it also impacts us.
I come from more of a cultural studies perspective, so certainly I'm going to incorporate critical cultural theories, feminist theory, critical race theory, those kinds of things in my classes. But for me, one of the most important theories for my students to understand are the theories that come from the political economy area, because they need to understand the media systems and why the content we get is the way it is, and they need to understand, these transnational corporations that own this media, and especially when it comes to youth culture and the globalization of youth culture and this kind of homogenization of youth culture. So for me, that's a very important one for them to understand as well.
Can I just say ditto, 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 ditto.
Yeah, I think we've pretty well covered all of them. I would only just simply say from my own perspective that part of introducing the students to these various theoretical perspectives, and I mean, obviously, if you're graduate students, you're trying to help prepare them for the orientation for their own careers. But at the undergraduate level, as we run across all these various frames, including frame theory, the thing is that the purpose, at least in my own classes, that I say all of it moves toward, is that my own coursework falls within our own departmental offerings, and as a community of scholars, as a collective of educators, what we are trying to do is to help promote social justice, and that they're part of that movement.
Okay, we have time for one more point.
Even though I'm in the position of being a teacher, I'm not great at explaining
personally, I teach what I'm comfortable teaching and what I feel, what's important, but also what I'm expert in. Just because the book has it doesn't mean you have to do it. So I wouldn't let the book dictate what you teach.
You can always find some kind of instructional media to explain some of those things. I think some of those are interesting from a historical standpoint of just looking at very, very early images that were transmitted and how far we've come in that. But I agree with Rebecca. Because it's in the book doesn't mean you have to teach it.
If you have the time and you're so oriented, you might consider, if you have them doing group projects, you might have that as a possible group project topic. Because what frequently comes out is the tech-oriented students, if you have them fill out a survey at the beginning indicating what they're most interested in, if you cluster those students, sometimes they can give a presentation you'll learn from, and then the rest of the class will as well. So I've had some luck with that, and it's also kind of a way to see what you're missing, over time.
Okay, well, that concludes our panel. I'd like to thank the panelists, and I'd like to thank all of you for attending.